we're in the book of Ecclesiastes. We did our prologue a couple weeks ago. We talked about well, hold on. We did our introduction a couple weeks ago. We did the prologue last week, which was chapter 1. And now we're going to get into chapter 2. And just for a little bit of review, we believe this is the wisdom of Solomon. And Solomon was the wisest man of his time, arguably the wealthiest man of his time, and arguably one of the most honored men of his time. He's the king over Israel, and nobody can tell him, hey, you can't do that. Hey, maybe you shouldn't do that. He has access to do whatever he wants, and that's exactly what he does. And especially as we read in chapter 2 today, we're going to see that Solomon tries everything, unrestrained, trying anything he wants to. And he's trying to find meaning. He's trying to find fulfillment in life under the sun. And last class, we had a good discussion and distinction that needed to be made is the vast majority of the time that we see the phrase under the sun in the book of Ecclesiastes, we are talking about life under the sun without God. We're going to see God step into the picture every now and then especially as we get to the end, we're going to see it really explode. But Solomon is looking for fulfillment. He's looking for meaning without God. And we're going to see that especially here in chapter 2, just unrestrained, do whatever I want and see if it means anything, see if it fulfills me. And last week we talked about the prologue. Some of the conclusions are already that this is vanity of vanities. Of all the things that are useless, empty, lacking substance, and fleeting, life under the sun without God is the most meaningless. It's the most useless. It's the most fleeting. It's the most just insignificant thing that you can imagine. And so then at the end of chapter 1, we were talking about verses 12 through 18, where it's sort of this preacher or teacher's quest. And he says, I set my mind to know wisdom, to know folly, and to search for all these things by wisdom. He says, I'm searching by wisdom. And I think we're going to see some of that today as well. And so before we get into chapter 2, does anybody have any leftover thoughts from chapter 1 or prologue or Solomon or anything? All right. Well, let's jump right into chapter 2 then. And you can see on the screen here, these are just going to be basic general overviews that I came up with on these chapters. And it's sort of wealth, wisdom, and work. We're going to see, almost said Jesus explore, not Jesus. We're going to see Solomon explore wealth, wisdom, and work. And wealth might not be the best word for it because we're going to see it's a wealth of something, not necessarily wealth itself. And so here in chapter 2, why don't we start and just read the first 11 verses. First 11 verses together, please. I said to myself, come now, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And behold, it too was futility. I said of laughter, it's madness. And of pleasure, what does it accomplish? I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine, while my mind was guiding me wisely, and how to take hold of folly until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made ponds of water for myself, from which to irrigate a forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. Also, I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold and treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. Then I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. My wisdom also stood by me. Look at verse 10. I think this is important. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was the reward for all my labor. Thus I considered all my activities which my hands had done, and the labor which I had exerted. And behold, all was vanity, and striving after wind, and there was no profit under the sun. So in this section, I kind of call it wealth, but it's not really wealth. It's sort of a wealth of pleasures in this whole section, a wealth of pleasures. And so did you notice I tried to read it in a certain way that it would stand out. How many times Solomon says, I did this for myself. I built these things for myself. I did this. I built this. I made these things for myself, for my personal pleasures. I mean, I don't know about your translation, but I know the phrase for myself shows up at least 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I see 7 right now. There's at least 7 times he says for myself. And I don't even know count up the number of times he says I, how much he's focusing on himself. And that's sort of the whole purpose of this. He is trying to find fulfillment in whatever looks good to him. And he says that pretty specifically for us here. It's self-indulgent. He's trying to find what is fulfilling. And so what's interesting to me here is in verse 2, we're focusing on the questions a lot as we go through. Verse 2, there's a question. I said of laughter, it's madness, and of pleasure, what does it accomplish? And so as Solomon is searching through these different pleasures, he is trying to answer this question, what do any of these pleasures accomplish? And as we go through it, and as we see so many times, he essentially says the same answer to the questions that we saw in chapter 1. Nothing. These pleasures and seeking things that are self-indulgent, just going after whatever I want to do, it accomplishes nothing. In all of these things that I'm doing, it accomplishes nothing. Are there any thoughts before we keep going in some of this section? Yes, sir.
I think when he said accomplish, that he looks back that I'm no better off than I was before I did it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Dan just said that he's no better off after he did that than before he did that. So what did it accomplish? Nothing. It accomplished nothing. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, what's fascinating in verse 1 is he says, I will test you with pleasure. So enjoy yourself. And he already gives us the conclusion in verse 1. Behold, it too was futility. And in verse 3, I think it sort of expands on this idea of testing. And it's fascinating to me because at the end of chapter 1, we mentioned this just minutely this morning, but in verse 13, where his quest to try and find fulfillment, to try and find meaning, he says in verse 13, I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom. So in all of this testing and seeking fulfillment and all this stuff, he says he's doing it by wisdom. And verse 3, look what he says. I explored with my mind how to stimulate my body with wine while my mind guided me wisely. And so it's almost like, I don't know if this is exactly the case, but just the way that he says this, it's almost like, okay, how much of this can I drink before I start to lose my senses? Because he says I'm doing it with my mind. I'm doing it with my mind. So, okay, where's the line? How much do I got to drink before I start to lose my senses? Because then he also says how to take hold of folly. So first he's like, okay, where is the line where I can still keep my wisdom, still keep my senses? But then he's like, I'm also going to take hold of folly. So he's doing both ends of this. Okay, how far can I go? And then also, let's just jump all the way. Sorry, that was probably loud. That was right next to the mic. How far to this deep end can I go? I'm going to take hold of folly and wisdom. So let's test it and see if either side of that is fulfilling to me. And he says, until I could see what good there is for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives. And so is there any fulfillment to be found in, okay, just a little bit? Can I test the limits here? How far can I go? And then also, let's just go full folly and let's drink this wine till I'm gone. You know what I mean? Any thoughts on any of that? Okay. Well, let's keep going in this next section. So not only does he talk about exploring how to stimulate his body with wine, he says wine specifically in verse 3. So that's a pleasure that he goes after. But also he goes after this pleasure of works and building things and making these beautiful structures. And so he says, I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself, gardens and parks for myself. Fruit trees, ponds of water to irrigate a forest of growing trees. And so in this section, I don't know, have you ever built a shed? Anybody ever built a shed or like you build? I mean, I know Dan has built stuff. He built this. He's built all kinds of stuff. There's a sense of accomplishment that you get when you build something, isn't there? Or like you've got a backyard and you've got a project that you want to do in the backyard. Maybe you want to grow a garden and you till the ground, you put all this work in and you get some stuff out of that garden. That feels pretty good. Or I don't know, just list off whatever it is. There's a sense of accomplishment in those things. And so Solomon is saying, okay, I built these things for myself. I built that. I put ponds in. I did all this stuff and I got a forest of growing trees. I got houses. I got all this stuff. I enlarged my works. And again, all of it is for himself. We see it over and over and over again. And maybe there is some kind of sense of accomplishment in this, a sense of, man, look what I just made. This is great. But we also are going to see his conclusion from even that. How long does that last? Well, not very long, because just as we get down to a little bit of this, he says it's vanity and striving after wind, and there's no profit under the sun. You can build the most beautiful things. You can have the best garden, have the best projects in the world, but how long is that going to last? And his point is it doesn't last very long. Any thoughts on any of that before we keep going? Anybody ever felt that, like the sense of accomplishment, and then it's like, well, I guess that's gone. Anybody have anything in your backyard right now that when you finish that, man, that was a big deal, but now it's just, it's my backyard. Yeah, all right, cool. So I'm not the only one. Great. Uh, in verses 4 through 6 here, where it's talking about the sense of accomplishment here, one of the things that I want to notice again, when we were talking about the wealth of Solomon, as we were looking at so many things about Solomon, it said that there was no king like him before and there was no king like him after. So these are not just, I've got this DIY, rough structure in my field. These are immaculate things. We could read about the building of Solomon's house. I think it's not a coincidence that Solomon's personal home and how it was built is described to us right alongside the temple. I mean, it was an immaculate structure, just like the temple was an immaculate structure. And I don't think that it's an accident. And it talks about his ivory throne covered in gold, all this stuff. And we even see Solomon's conclusion here is, I did all that stuff for myself. And even that's vanity and striving after wind. So maybe for us, we're like, well, once I get that house, once I get that car, once I get whatever it is, well, how long does that last? Probably not very long. Okay, any thoughts on any of that? Yes, sir.
Your call. I guess I had never keyed in this particular passage on the number of times that he says, for myself. All of these things were done for myself, and you kind of brought that up a second ago. So do you think that he would have found any more fulfillment if these things had been done for others? That they weren't just for himself? Because yes, people can enjoy gardens, they can enjoy fountains, they can enjoy all the things that he has built. But the reason that he appears to have done them was for his own self-fulfillment. And that just ended up being emptiness.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know, curious on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll say stay tuned for the next episode of Ecclesiastes, because I think we're going to see that later on in Ecclesiastes, where he's going to say, here's some good things, and it's going to be about other people and not just the self-indulgence. So yeah, not here because he hasn't gotten there yet, but absolutely, I think later he's going to say that. That's a great question to bring up right now too. That's great. Any other thoughts? Okay. Well, in verses 7 and 8, so we see these sort of works, gardens, structures, things like that, but also let's look at verses 7 and 8 again. I bought male and female slaves, and I had homeborn slaves. I possessed flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. Also, I collected for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and provinces. I provided for myself male and female singers and the pleasures of men, many concubines. And so one of the things I want to point out about this section that's different than the previous section is, the previous section, like on works and structures and things like that, is there anything inherently wrong with that? Building those things, having ponds? No, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But then we get into 7 and 8, and then it starts to get a little sticky. Like, I don't know about you all, but I would be real uncomfortable with buying male and female slaves, or even if they're not the slaves that we would think about in our modern context. There's still a lot of biblical precedent about how you treat them, all kinds of stuff like that. So we've got slaves in verse 7. He's possessing flocks and herds larger than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. There are several things in the law about it's not a bad thing to have flocks and herds, but like if you are increasing to where you are oppressing other people, by the way, what do we know about Solomon's taxes against the people? They were exorbitantly high. Very high taxes against the people. So how is he funding all these projects? How is he funding, these flocks and herds that he has? He's oppressing the people in some way here, and that's a problem. And then even further in verse 8, the silver and gold, how does he get that? He's got tribute coming in. We talked about all those things, but also those taxes on the people. And he gets male and female singers, this entertainment. There's nothing wrong with entertainment in and of itself. But then you look at the last line of verse 8 and the pleasures of men. Many concubines. I mean, we talked about it. I always get this backwards. I think it's 700 wives and 300 concubines. Or maybe it's 300 wives and 700. I think it's 700 and 300, right? 700 wives. Thank you. 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's nuts. And God in no way approves of that. I mean, we see it over and over and over and over again. But one of the valuable things about Ecclesiastes and Solomon trying everything is his conclusion to these things. He's trying things that are even morally, like, at least on the line, and then other things that are for sure wrong. And his conclusion is going to be, you know what? This is not worth it. I've tried it and it's not worth it. And so in our society, especially where, I mean, you can't even watch a commercial without some kind of sexual innuendos and sexual content, which is basically like, if you just sleep with everybody that you see, you're going to be fulfilled. Well, here's Solomon, who pretty much did that. And he says, you know what? That was not it. It was unfulfilling. It was vanity and striving after wind. And I think there's a lot of value in that for us. It's like, he tried it, so I don't have to. That's great, isn't it? That's great. Any thoughts on that before we keep going? Because the same idea is going to continue. Okay. We talked about silver and gold, and one of the things that we talked about in the introduction with Solomon, one of my favorite lines is, Solomon made silver as common as stones in the land of Israel. You remember that? And silver was of no value in Solomon's day. And so it's just an amazing thing about how wealthy he is. And he says, it's not worth it. Verse 9, he says, I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem, and my wisdom also stood by me. There's an interesting sort of debate or thing to think about with Solomon here is, God spoke directly to Solomon, in his life. God spoke directly to Solomon. God gave him some amount of wisdom supernaturally, and then Solomon gains wisdom throughout this experience. And Solomon is doing all these things, trying everything, withholding nothing, and he says, my wisdom stood by me. And so it's interesting because there's this whole discussion about, did Solomon forget God in all of this? I don't think he did. I think he intentionally is placing God to the side and searching for fulfillment without him. Because he says over and over and over again, my wisdom stood by me. And it's a really fascinating thing. And so verse 10, right after saying my wisdom stood by me, he says, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. And I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. And then look at this line. My heart was pleased because of all my labor. And this was the reward for my labor. So when we're talking about seeking these self-indulgent pleasures, some of them, there's really no problem with them in and of themselves, but some are like right on the line of morally repugnant. And then there's others that are way past the line that Solomon does here. And what's one of his conclusions here at the end of verse 10? This might not be the politically correct way to say this, but he basically says, you know what? There was some pleasure in those pleasures. There was some pleasure in those pleasures. It was short, it was fleeting, but there was a little bit of pleasure in those pleasures. And he says, and that was the reward. That was it. That little bit of pleasure that I got in those pleasures, that was it. And then verse 11, we get the long-term conclusion. The short term is, okay, yeah, maybe these things are pleasurable in the short term. But verse 11, thus I considered all my activities, and which my hands had done, the labor which I exerted. Behold, all was vanity and striving after wind. And he says, there was no profit under the sun. So we see this whole idea of, yeah, there might be some short-term pleasure in these things, but you know what? At the end of the day, I tried all these things. I didn't withhold one thing. And in the long term, it's nothing. There's no profit. Striving after wind, it's vanity. Yes, sir.
He talked about getting all in prayer, fasting, all very good things to do.
Yeah.
But if you do them to be seen by men, Jesus says that is your full reward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Eddie's talking about Matthew 6, and Jesus was giving warnings against what people of the day were doing in their fasting, in their praying, in their giving. There was another one, I can't remember what it was, forgiving maybe. In all of those things, they were only doing it to be seen by men. And Jesus says at least 3 times in that section, they have their reward in full. There is nothing left to be paid out by God. That's all they're getting. There's no long-term gain to any of that. So it's very much like that, for sure. Any other thoughts on this section? Yes, sir.
I think it's interesting, and it's frankly awesome to see someone who was so wise in Solomon to go through these things and to come to these conclusions, because us who are not as wise as Solomon was, we do these things, or we see these things and we think, okay, yes, that was pleasurable, or yes, I have come and I have gotten my reward. And I realized so quick that that was not worth it.
Mhm.
Usually not in the moment we realize that, but shortly after we do. But then we have short-term memory and we're like, I'm gonna do it again.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna do it again. But to see him have come to this conclusion and then to say there was nothing gained under the sun. That's important to me to see that after everything. He's like, in the long term, it was all vanity.
Yeah.
And us to have the short-term memory and just keep making the same mistakes, it's frustrating. But if we could look at this and really take this to heart and see that it's really not worth it, that's awesome.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for us, maybe to make it a more modern version of the exact same thing is how many movie stars do we see? How many professional athletes or just super rich people who have every opportunity to do all kinds of things? They have all the means. And then so many of them turn to drugs. They are hooked on, alcohol, substance abuse, just whatever it is. And then they've got mental health problems. They've got all kinds, just all kinds of things that happen. And we think, well, if I just get all of these things, if I can just attain to that, then things will be good. And I think Solomon would say, no, that's not the case. So yeah, that's a great thing to bring up too. Any other thoughts on this section? Okay. Oh, yes, sir.
Makes me think of Moses, another great Bible character, where in Hebrews, it said, he chose not to enjoy the pleasure of sin for a season, but just an acknowledgement of the pleasures of sin. And I was just thinking about that, and with their younger folks, and particularly when they reach those teenage years, and they're getting out on their own. And I think we might be making a mistake if we act like there is no pleasure of sin, there is no temptation of sin, because they see it. They don't believe us, to be frank, they're not going to believe. So it might be better, whatever that age is for a particular child, to just acknowledge that, but talk about exactly like we heard from Moses, and we're learning as we go through this from Solomon. As Cole said, it's just not worth it. Well, why? You know what I mean? So instead of just pushing it away and act like it's awful, it's terrible, and it is in the right perspective, but not even acknowledge there is a temptation. I think maybe it may allow our children to question us without question.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The sort of taboo around certain subjects. We don't talk about it in this way, but the scriptures do. So do we think that we're going to do better than what God has revealed to us? I don't think so. I hope that we don't. Let's do what God reveals to us. Yeah.
Just in my experience, Jana was excellent with girls. And there were some things I just wasn't as comfortable about. They could go there. He helped them stay away from things. They didn't need to explore that. So I just want to go there.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm like mentally making a note for my two girls. So I appreciate that. Yeah. Okay. Anything else on this section? Okay. So I kind of have that as the wealth section, but it's more than just wealth and stuff and things, but it's a wealth of pleasure, self-indulgent pleasures. Well, let's get into this next section because Solomon's going to talk about wisdom. Is wisdom something that will fulfill? And again, we've got to acknowledge this is wisdom under the sun without God, not wisdom like in the Proverbs and other places that we see is very good. But let's read verses 12 through 17, please. 12 through 17. And again, notice the questions as we read through this. 12 through 17. So I turn to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity, for there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. I love this section. I really do. And I think it hits so much harder because of who this is. It's a whole section on wisdom. Verse 12, the first question that he asked there, he's like, okay, I'm going to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. And the question he asked in verse 12 is, what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And that's sort of a throwback to chapter 1. Didn't we talk about, one generation comes and another generation passes away, and the former things aren't forgotten, and the people who are hip and with it now, people in the future, they're not going to remember them. And all these things are vanity and striving after wind. And so Solomon is saying, okay, what's the man going to do who comes after the king except what's already been done? So it's almost like he's saying, what's if whoever comes king after me, what's that guy going to do that's different than what I've already done, or what maybe the king before that's already done, or some king around us has already done? And the point is that, well, nothing. Is he going to be a ruler with wisdom? Is he going to be a ruler with folly? Who knows? Hey, David was a pretty good king, right? Really good king. Solomon, hey, he's got a lot of wisdom from God, but there's some problems with Solomon. There's some problems with David. There's a lot of problems with Saul that we saw. You know what I'm trying to say. And so he's saying, who knows if the king after him is going to be a wise man or a foolish man? But then, verse 13, we do get a conclusion. So even in wisdom under the sun, just talking about being a fool or being a wise man under the sun without God, a conclusion is wisdom does excel folly as light excels darkness. Even in under the sun, earthly wisdom, Solomon acknowledges there is value to wisdom. There is value to being wise and prudent versus being a fool, especially if you're a king, especially if you're a ruler. And he says, as light excels darkness. I mean, how much further apart can you get? I know you all know the illustrations of like maybe Mammoth Cave. Anybody been to Mammoth Cave? Yeah. So if you turn those lights on in Mammoth Cave, it's like, whoa. And then you turn those lights out and it's just completely dark. You can't see your hand right here. Just a little bit of light goes a long way. And so Solomon says, wisdom excels folly like light excels darkness. So that's a really big deal, and a conclusion that we do need to see. Even wisdom under the sun is advantageous. It's good. But verse 14, it's almost like he flip-flops a little bit. He's like, okay, there is some good in wisdom versus folly, even in life under the sun. But verse 14, he says, okay, the wise man's eyes are in his head. He actually sees things, but the fool walks in darkness. We were just talking about there's an advantage to wisdom. But then look at the end of verse 14. And yet, I know that one fate befalls them both. So here's this wise man who's made wise decisions all of his life. He's going to die. Here's this foolish man who's made foolish decisions all of his life, and he's going to die. And so Solomon's looking at this, and he's like, okay, no matter how wise somebody is, they're going to die. No matter how foolish somebody is, they're just going to die. And we could couple this with chapter 1. No one's going to remember those people anyway, which is something else he says here. So he's going to be like, what's the point of wisdom then? If we're just going to have the same end, what's the point? And that's exactly what he says. Look at verse 15. This is another question. So if you're doing the circling in green, verse 15 is another one. I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall. And look here, he doesn't say some wise man. He says, so it will befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. So even if before he was sort of just thinking abstractly about people out there, Solomon now is bringing it very close to home. He's saying, look, that foolish man who has done dumb things and made terrible decisions his entire life, that guy's going to die just like me. Why have I been extremely wise? What's the purpose in all this? If we're all just going to die, this is vanity. It's useless. It's fleeting. And then verse 16, we alluded to this just a second ago, but there's no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, how the wise man and the fool alike die. So he really is coupling this with some conclusions from chapter 1, which is Solomon was told, do you remember Solomon was told by God, I'm going to give you wisdom and I'm going to give you all these other things so that there will be no one like you before you or after you. God told Solomon that. You remember that? So Solomon knows that. And he says, why have I become extremely wise? I'm just going to die like that foolish man over there. And things are going to go on and people don't remember things of the past. So what's the point? It's kind of depressing, isn't it? What's the point in all this? He says, this is vanity. People won't remember. We all die alike. And so verse 17 for Solomon, who knows that there's going to be no one like him in wisdom, look at his conclusion, or at least what this causes him to do. So I hated life. How could you not, if you know you're the wisest man? I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me. Everything is futility, and everything is striving after wind. So, man, what a section. Any thoughts on anything in there? Okay. Well, this one really stands out to me personally, because we know Solomon's wisdom. People came from the ends of the earth to find Solomon and hear some of his wisdom. And Solomon says, even that doesn't fulfill. Even that is fleeting. Even that is meaningless. And so that just really hits hard for me. Okay, any thoughts on that one before we go on to the last section? Okay, well, we've seen where a wealth of pleasures does not fulfill. We've seen where earthly wisdom is good. There is good that comes from it, but it doesn't fulfill. It's not lasting, because the end is the same for every person. Let's look at this last section. Will work fulfill? And let's read verses 18 through, let's do 18 through 23 and then save 24 through 26 for later. 18 through 23. Let's see. Verse 18, thus I hated all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun, for I must leave it to the man who will come after me. Who knows whether he will be a wise man or a fool? Yet he will have control over all the fruit of my labor for which I have labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. Therefore I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I had labored under the sun. When there is a man who has labored with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, then he gives his legacy to one who has not labored with them. This too is vanity and a great evil. For what does a man get in all his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. And so talking about in this section, the word labor, or your version might say toil, is used at least 11 times here. And the 11 times I'm counting is in the New American Standard 95. And so Solomon is really connecting, I think, everything together. We've seen him do these works and these ponds, these structures, all that stuff. We've seen him explore things by wisdom. I think he sort of connects them together, because he says, I hated all the fruit of my labor. What's the purpose of all this labor and all this toiling that I've done under the sun? Because he says at the end of verse 18, I'm just going to leave all of the fruit and rewards for all of my toil and labor to whoever comes after me. I don't get to take any of that stuff with me. None of that stuff is going to matter when I'm dead to me. So what's the point in all this? And then he says, let's see, in verse 19, we get another question. So if you're doing your little green circles, he says, who knows about that person you're going to leave all your stuff to? You don't know if they're going to be wise with your stuff or if they're going to be a fool. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they're wise or a fool, because you left it to them and you're gone. And he says, you're going to have no control. They have all control over the fruit of your labors, which you labored, even if you labored in wisdom your entire life, made great decisions. You amassed this amazing wealth and all this stuff by wisdom. You leave it to them and they act with it foolishly. You've got no control over that. And so he hates it. He hates all the labor that he's done under the sun. He says it's vanity. It's complete futility. And look at, let's see, verse 20. Again, he says, I completely despaired of all the fruit of my labor for which I labored under the sun. And verse 21, I really think he's looking at himself. He says, there's a man who labored with wisdom and knowledge and skill. I mean, that's toil. That's a lot of striving. That's a lot of good, wise decisions made throughout his life. And he says he's just going to give that legacy to somebody who hasn't worked for them. He says that too is vanity and a great evil. And I think for a lot of us, we just intrinsically know this. When you work hard for something, you really appreciate that. Maybe you've worked hard to buy that one car that your dad had or that your mom had or whatever it is. You're going to take care of that thing because it means something to you. But then maybe you pass on and leave it to somebody. It's got a little sentimental value, but like, let's just give it to me. So yeah, I'll take care of it. But if, maybe I'll just sell it, get some money from it, Doesn't that happen all the time? We see that all the time. Or we can see different examples. And what's fascinating with Solomon specifically, who was king after Solomon in Judah? Rehoboam. And so you talk about somebody who took a legacy and then just threw it away. Sorry, doing it again. Someone who took a legacy and threw it away. Take a look at Rehoboam. Some of the things that he did and things that he said. He was, the actions that he took were known by God beforehand. I want to say that. God knew that Rehoboam was going to do this. But Rehoboam had an opportunity, just like Jeroboam had an opportunity, because the people came to Rehoboam and was like, okay, if you lead with grace and with mercy, then we'll all follow you. And then what does he say about a thumb? About Solomon's thumb, or his thumb and Solomon's thigh? See, now that I said it like that, I can't even remember how it goes. He says something along the lines of, my thumb is going to be thicker than my father's thigh, especially in imposing heavy taxes on the people. He says, my father disciplined you with whips, but I'm going to discipline you with scorpions. So he had this opportunity to bring the people together and do all kinds of stuff, and he just squanders it. So even in Solomon's own life, after Solomon's life, the very thing that he's worried about happens with his son. I mean, wow. And so he's saying in all of these things, what does a man get in verse 22? There's another question. What does a man get in all of his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun? He says, all of his days are painful and grievous, and at night his mind doesn't rest. This too is vanity. And I think that's very similar to what we read, and we're going to read in another spot, where the belly of a rich man keeps him awake at night. You know, he's got so many things that he has so many things to worry about, or so many labors and works, and you've got so much to worry about that you can't even sleep at night. I think that's what Solomon is talking about here. And even in all of those sleepless nights and all those toils, all those labors, those wise decisions, he's saying, I'm just going to leave that to somebody, and I have no idea how they're going to handle it. And we know Rehoboam didn't handle it well. And so he loses 10 of the 12 tribes and only keeps 2 in his kingdom. So, wow. I mean, not even these earthly labors, all this stuff, it doesn't fulfill. It has no long-term fulfillment. Any thoughts on that section before we get to the last one? Yes, sir.
There is a section in there where it says a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children.
Yeah.
So that's not the problem. Just to make it clear, right? It's not the problem. In fact, it's committed. But if it's without any spirit of respect, like you always says.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great thing to bring up, that it's not leaving an inheritance. That's the problem. It's the despair that he's going through about what use is it if they're foolish with it and squander it. You know, all this labor I've done has gone to nothing. So yeah, that's a great point to bring up. Well, let's read the last section, because when God comes into the picture, we see the tune change dramatically. And so if you're doing any kind of marking or whatever, I highly encourage you, if you have yellow, when you see God mentioned in Ecclesiastes, underline God in yellow. Because when you see yellow, it really is like a little ray of sunshine most of the time. Not all the time in Ecclesiastes, but most of the time it is. So let's read verses 24 through 26. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good. This also I have seen, that it is from the hand of God. Look at this question, verse 25. For who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? For to a person who is good in his sight, he's given wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner, he's given the task of gathering and collecting, so that he may give to the one who is good in God's sight. And even in that, Solomon says, this too is vanity and striving after wind. So again, we get this glimpse of God coming into the picture. And if you remember our broad structure of this book, really the beginning of chapter 9, God in the picture starts to explode. But all along the way, we're going to see little glimpses in this journey that Solomon is going through trying to find fulfillment. And so he's just said, these labors are worthless. Like, I'm just going to leave it to somebody and they might completely squander it. But he says, there's nothing better for a man to eat and drink and tell himself that his labor is good, to enjoy the fruits of one's labor in life under the sun. Because he says, this is from the hand of God. Just enjoying those things that we work hard for in our lifetime, he says that's from the hand of God. That's a good thing. It's good to work hard and enjoy the fruits of your labor. And verse 25, this question is such a good one. Who can eat and who can have enjoyment without him? Without God, who can have this enjoyment? If God's not in the picture, you're going to be looking at your toils and your labors and saying, I'm just going to die. Who am I leaving it to? And it means nothing. But with God in the picture, all of a sudden, wow, I can really enjoy this stuff and see that it's from the hand of God. Verse 26, though, is fascinating to me because we see a mix of both in here. Because he says, for a person to a person who's good in God's sight, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy, while to the sinner, he's given the task of gathering and collecting so that he may give to the one who's good in God's sight. This too is vanity and striving after wind. So it's almost like Solomon is saying, if you follow the principles that God kind of lays out, things are going to go well generally in a lot of these things, and you can enjoy the fruits of your labor. But one of the things that is still vanity and striving after wind is that a lot of those good things have to come from somewhere. And so like if you own a farm or something, who's going to be working? Maybe you do it, but it looks like here he's saying to these people who are sinners in this case are given the task of gathering and collecting so that they may give to the one who's good in God's sight. And so even in the good that might happen to those who are good in God's sight, he's saying, there's some people that don't acknowledge God, and that's vanity, and that's striving after wind, and they're just going to be serving those who are good in God's sight. So really, there is good that comes out of this, but even in some of the good, there's still a level of striving after wind and vanity. Okay, any thoughts on this section? What time do we normally end? Is it 9:45 that we normally end? Let's go. We got 5 minutes. Okay. Okay. That was the first one, right? Okay. I just want to notice how drastically different verses 24 through 26 are from the rest of this chapter. I mean, do we see that? We see there's nothing better for a man than to ... And it's the gift of God. It's from God. Versus we see Solomon trying everything. I think the key to this entire chapter is verse 10. Chapter 2, verse 10. Let's reread verse 10 because this makes it so powerful for us. Verse 10. Solomon says, all that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure, for my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was the reward for my labor. So we see Solomon tries everything, every kind of self-indulgent pleasure, every kind of worldly wisdom, every kind of labor and toil in life under the sun. And his conclusion is none of that stuff matters without God. None of it does, because you're just going to die, pass it on to somebody else, or those things, they're short-term pleasures, and then 5 minutes later, you know what? It's really not that fulfilling. But we do see a big conclusion that there is good in life under the sun when God is in the picture. We can enjoy the fruits of our labor and enjoy things. Because verse 25, the question is, who can eat? Who can have enjoyment without God? And the answer is nobody without God. Okay, any thoughts or anything from this chapter as a whole?
I think just a little bit of contrast in the first part, he's going to the excess everything. And just the idea in this section is you don't have to have excess, you have full amount of enough.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, Dan was just saying that in the first half, you see the excess of pleasures and things like that. But then excess of money and pleasures of everything versus the end of this chapter. And it looks like more contentment with what you have. And you can have an abundance, but not the excess. And that's kind of what Solomon's saying here. So yeah, that's a great thing to bring up. Anything else in this section? Yes, sir.
It's clear to me that all of it, without it, he saw all these things, probably some of which we were thinking about to accomplish. And it reminds me so much of the different stages of my life where I was striving for something. I thought at first that Solomon must have been a sophomore in college when he wrote some of this stuff, because you get to that point where you get into second semester of whatever it is you're studying, and you realize, I'm busting my butt here trying to get all this stuff done, and it doesn't mean a thing, And then you get through college, and you get into a career, you're grinding it out, trying to get something, and at some point, somewhere along the way, you're at a conference or somewhere, you're like, these people are fools, what are we doing here? So you find these platforms, or you find those in your life where you reach these things, and I think his wisdom here. I was wondering how long through this whole discussion, what kind of metric is he measuring wisdom by here to keep saying how much that is his own foolishness that applies, you know? And I suspect that before it was all said and done, he went through this phase several times in his life before he was examining these things in this way. And I think that is where God is speaking. You said that God spoke to Solomon. I think God is speaking to Solomon. These moments of insight as well. Speaking to us, we using him as a microphone to speak to mankind.
Yeah, absolutely. And in all of that, that was great. You know, this whole book is Solomon, likely as an older man, reflecting on these things and gets to these plateaus in his life where he's tried things and things just feel useless and meaningless. And it's so valuable for us because has anybody else ever experienced that? That's why it's so valuable for us. And one of the valuable things for us is we might want to try some of these things. Like, man, I just feel so useless and meaningless, and life just seems so striving after wind and fleeting. So I'm going to go try this thing. Well, we can look here and say, even if I do that and go to the excess, it's not going to make me fulfilled. That's not going to fill me with this hole that I have in my heart that I'm trying to fill, which is what we're going to talk about in chapter 3. That's a great segue. And so we'll stop there this morning and read chapter 3, please, for next week. Thank you all.